everybody. My name's Pat Lynn, and I'm here at Cary Blake Park on the playground on a cold spring day to introduce you to my project. This playground is an ADA accessible playground according to the ADA laws of 2010, which are the most recent, which suggests that every playground that's built with public dollars, in other words tax dollars, should be built so that it's accessible. Well, what does accessible mean? According to them, it means that you can get to the playground, that you can maneuver around the playground if you're in a wheelchair, that in between the play structures there's space to do that, and that every play structure has a platform so that you can transfer onto it if you're able to get your wheelchair next to it. So if this counts as an ADA accessible playground, how come I'm sitting in my wheelchair not on the playground? I personally think this is a social injustice. As a father of 3 kids, it's important to me to be able to get to where my kids are and to interact with them on the playground. And I really truly believe that every kid should get to play, especially in our public spaces that are used for public things and built with public money. So in my project, I want to explore this idea and introduce you to the difference between accessibility and what I would call inclusivity, something that maybe goes a step further. And then I want to talk about how the church and why the church should be a front runner in this area. Behind me now is the brand new jump playground at the H.J. Carroll Park in Chimacum, Washington. And this is also an accessible playground. But how is it different than the first playground I showed you? Well, I think this playground goes beyond being just accessible, meaning that someone in a wheelchair could get to it, but it's inclusive. It includes things that allow people in chairs and with other various disabilities to play and interact with everyone else in society. So let me walk you through what those are. I hope you enjoyed some of those things from that playground in Chimacum. They certainly did a fantastic job building that and making it inclusive. I brought you back to my living room to show you what my project's going to cover, the scope and sequence of what we'll be talking about. And so I've entitled my project America's Inaccessible Playground and the ADA Act of 2010's failure to meet the basic need. I think it's pretty clear what I've already shown you, that there's a big difference between what's actually usable and I would call inclusive and what is considered accessible. So why is this important? Well, there's a few reasons. I really believe that every kid should get to play. Every kid. It doesn't matter how able-bodied you are, if you're an athlete or you are in a wheelchair or have some other disability. Play is just an essential thing for all of us. Multiple studies show that a playground is where so many things develop. You develop both physically, skills, you develop social skills, social cues. You learn how you can participate in part of the community, and that makes this incredibly significant. This to me is an injustice. It's an injustice that there's an entire portion of our population that doesn't get the choice, right? They can't even choose to participate because they can't get there. To me, that's not okay. And so lastly, if our tax dollars are being used to build these things, they really should include everyone. Everyone pays taxes. Some might argue against this. Well, there's a lot of people who are on disability in chairs that, are receiving things like Social Security disability and others. But it's a part of our community. They need to be included. And then just from a biblical perspective, if Jesus came for all, If Jesus came for all, and play is one of the ways that God has us expressing joy, they need to be able to express joy in the same way. So there's a difference between accessible and inclusive. And I think I've covered this basically, but I'm going to go over it in my paper and here just for a moment. An accessible playground, according to law, requires that you have a paved path to the playground. It requires that there is space that's adequate in between play structures for someone in a wheelchair to be able to maneuver. And it requires that there are transfer spaces so that someone could transfer out of a wheelchair onto the play structure. Those are the requirements. There is nothing more. It does not require play structures specifically designed for people in wheelchairs. You don't have to have one. It does not require any other kind of play structure for someone who might have a different type of disability, say like a sensory issue. It does not require a manufactured ground covering so that people in wheelchairs and with other disabilities can participate in the park. This is a huge deal. It doesn't require fencing around the park, which many parents would love to have fencing around a park anyway, just because I'd love to be able to sit down and know that my kids are safe as they're playing. But what if you have a child who, say, is autistic or has some other type of a developmental disability? You want to make sure that's a safe space with a fence, and fences are not required. And so I have listed on here other stimulus type things like you saw in the playground where someone can go and do a sensory touch or even sound and musical instruments. None of those things are required. Those are all optional issues. Inclusive playgrounds like to include these things. They have a manufactured surface so that everyone can use the space. They have inclusive play structures. They have sensory items, and most importantly, they got a fence. Incredibly important. Here's the problem, and I think really there are several problems, but the basic thesis of this project is that the ADA law does not meet the need. Secondly, this problem affects one of America's most unnoticed and most unheard from populations. So people who already have insecurity issues feel like they don't fit in society. I'm 6'8". I used to walk above the crowd. Now I roll below the crowd, and the difference is amazing. Because when you're walking around at 6'8", everyone sees you. When you're in a wheelchair, you're virtually unnoticed. Lastly, updating playgrounds is expensive. Adding these things that I'm talking about is incredibly expensive. And so there are justifications for saying, hey, this doesn't need to be here. But I don't think they're okay. I think that if our tax dollars are paying for it, then there need to be found ways that everyone can be included. My rationale for my resources, excuse me, I'm sorry, I'm breaking down here at this moment. The U.S. Department of Justice, the ADA law itself, the 2010 Standards for Accessible Design, Section 1008, play areas, straight off the ada.gov. Play World, obviously using that because it is the standard. Play World, inclusive playgrounds versus accessible playgrounds, a great resource for looking at how people are trying to make places inclusive, and also information on why accessibility, or that term accessible, doesn't quite go far enough. The U.S. Department of Education, National Center for Educational Statistics, talking about disability in America. It's important to know what those numbers are so that we can include them here. General Recreation Incorporated, the facts of inclusivity. Again, another great resource on how to make places inclusive. I'm conducting 2 interviews. People that are building playgrounds. One is a pastor in Portland area who's right now fundraising to build an accessible and inclusive playground on his church property. I want to know why it's important to him to do that, and also the obstacles that he's had as he's doing it. And the second is I'll be interviewing a playground designer who designs and sells accessible playgrounds talking to her about, hey, what are the types of issues that when people go to do this, what do they have, and why does she think her mission is important? I think those are both significant pieces for this project. Also be using something from Kavanaugh's book, Being Consumed. I believe that his discourse on the Eucharist is incredibly significant, that Christ came to die for all, and as believers, we are laying out ourselves for others. So when we see someone who has a need or is in need, or social injustice that isn't being met, it's important to discuss these things. And then, of course, the Bible. My predicted project outcomes. Well, I don't believe the law goes far enough. I predict that I'm going to prove that in this paper. I'll also offer possible solutions. I think I've got a few that are actually doable and usable. And then I'm going to discuss why this topic is theologically important. I look forward to presenting this paper to you, and thank you for the opportunity to do so. Be blessed.